Have you ever wondered how well you really know someone? We all think we have the people in our lives figured out. Family, friends, even our neighbors. But what if everything you believed about a person was built on a lie? And not just any lie. A lie so deep, so destructive, that it could tear apart everything they've worked for? What would it take for someone to break? What kind of secret would it take for a man, trusted, respected, admired by all, to destroy everything he's built and everyone he loves? What if the truth, when it comes out, is so shocking that it turns his entire world upside down? This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about the darkness that can be hidden beneath the most perfect of lives. A story of family, faith, and a truth that, once uncovered, forces a man to face the unthinkable. But that's just the beginning. Imagine the picture-perfect life. A man with everything, a wife, children, a thriving business, a strong community. This man has it all, but everything is about to crumble. Because the truth, once it surfaces, will change everything. It will make you question how well you really know those around you. What do you do when you find out that everything you believed in is a lie? What happens when the person you trust most, the one you've built your world around, has been hiding a truth so dark, so painful, that it could shatter everything? That's the question Darnell Davis faces. But this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about the consequences of uncovering a secret too powerful to ignore. You're about to witness a man's life fall apart in ways you can't even imagine. What happens when trust is broken, when family is torn apart, when the unthinkable is done by the person you thought you knew? What happens when everything you thought was perfect turns out to be a carefully constructed facade? But this is where things get interesting. It's not just about the shock of discovery. It's about what comes next, the moments that follow, the choices made, the consequences that cannot be undone. And it's all building up to a single, devastating truth. What will you do when you're forced to face the darkest parts of your own soul? Can a man come back from a betrayal so deep, so personal? And what does it say about us, about our own humanity, when everything we thought we knew about someone is called into question? The truth is coming, but once you see it, you can never unsee it. Stay with us. This story is just beginning, and the truth, when it's finally revealed, will change everything. Up until now, you've been introduced to a picture-perfect family. The kind of family that neighbors envy, the kind of family that the community looks to as an example of stability. But behind closed doors, things aren't always what they seem. What if everything you believed about your life, your family, was built on a lie? A lie so deep that it would unravel everything in an instant. What if the person you trusted most, the one you've built your world around, was hiding something so devastating that it could destroy the foundation of everything you know? Let's go back to the beginning. The Davis family appeared to have it all. Darnell Davis was a skilled, well-respected barber in the community. His customers trusted him, admired him. He had a beautiful family, a loving wife, 3 children, a strong faith, and a reputation for generosity. They seemed like the ideal family, blessed by God, untouched by hardship. But this idyllic image, it's about to crack wide open. Now imagine, for a moment, the pressure of maintaining that image while everything around you is falling apart. Darnell's barbershop, once thriving, is on the brink of collapse. His debts are mounting, his business is struggling, and he's fighting a losing battle to keep the financial burden from tearing apart his family. But it's not just money that's weighing him down. It's the crushing weight of keeping up appearances. But here's the thing. Behind every smile, there's a story you haven't heard. And that story, it's about to shatter everything you thought you knew. Have you ever experienced that sinking feeling in the pit of your stomach? The one that tells you something isn't right, even when no one else sees it. That's the kind of feeling Darnell's family had, only they couldn't put their finger on it. What if, behind the calm and warmth of the Davis family, a brutal truth was waiting to come to light? A truth that would shake them to their very core. A truth that, when revealed, would make you question everything you thought you knew about them. The Davis family's life was built on trust. a trust that would soon be tested in ways they could never have imagined. As we peel back the layers of their lives, we will uncover the painful, devastating secret that will change everything. And it all starts with the seemingly simple act of trying to keep the family together. Now, let's focus on Tasha Davis, Darnell's wife. Tasha stands by him, as any devoted spouse would, but even she is harboring a secret, a deep, personal fracture in their marriage, one that Darnell can't even see. Tasha's strained relationship with her stepfather, Gregory Gordy Chase, has been slowly gnawing away at her for years. He's wealthy, emotionally distant, and completely indifferent to Darnell's struggles. Tasha's attempts to protect her family from his coldness have pushed her into emotional isolation. But that's just the surface. Beneath her attempts to keep the peace, something much darker is festering. What happens when a secret is too big to carry? What happens when the betrayal within a marriage is so deep that it's capable of destroying everything? Tasha's emotional distance, the growing tension, and the unresolved issues with Gordy, this is the undercurrent of pain that no one talks about. It's a quiet storm that no one sees coming. Every smile, every "I'm fine" masks the storm brewing inside her. And Darnell? He has no idea. He's too consumed by his own battle to notice what's really going on with her. But when the truth finally surfaces, it will be too late for any apologies. Then we have the children. Brandon Davis, the eldest. At 16, he's already beginning to feel the growing unrest. Confident, sometimes rebellious, Brandon is no stranger to questioning everything around him. He sees things for what they are, not what they appear to be. He's beginning to sense that there's more to his father's struggles than what meets the eye, and the tension in the house isn't something he can ignore any longer. He's searching for answers, but the deeper he digs, the more disturbing the truths become. Layla Davis, the 12-year-old middle child, soft-hearted and intuitive, Layla has always had an uncanny ability to pick up on things others can't. She notices the subtle changes in her parents' behavior, how her mother is growing more distant, how her father's smiles are becoming less genuine. Layla isn't yet old enough to fully understand the complexities of their lives, but she feels the weight of the unspoken tensions. She's the one who watches quietly, her concern growing by the day. And finally, there's Jalen Davis, the 6-year-old youngest of the family. Innocent, carefree, Jalen remains blissfully unaware of the storm quietly gathering around him. He still laughs without worry, still runs to his parents for comfort, still believes in the simplicity of his world. But all too soon, his innocence will be shattered as the cracks in his family's world begin to widen. And then there's Gregory Gordy Chase, Tasha's stepfather. Wealthy, distant, and seemingly indifferent to the struggles of his stepdaughter's family, Gordy is a man who commands respect, not by kindness, but by his cold, calculated nature. He has no love for Darnell, and he's made it clear that he holds no regard for the financial troubles that threaten to tear the Davis family apart. His presence is a constant tension, even in his absence. Gordy's power extends beyond money. It's the emotional control he exerts over Tasha and the coldness with which he interacts with Darnell. Each of these characters, individually, presents an image of strength, of warmth, of idealized family life. But when you put them together, you start to see the cracks forming. They look like they have it all: love, faith, success. But beneath that surface, something is about to shatter their perfect image. The Davis family has a secret, a truth so dark that when it comes to light, it will bring everything they built crashing down. And it all begins with the simple desire to protect the ones you love, even when doing so means sacrificing everything. What happens when the truth shatters the image of a perfect family? What happens when a wife's deepest secret, the one she's kept from the man she loves, is exposed? What if, in the end, it's not just about the money or the debts, but about something much darker, a betrayal so profound that it erases everything? It's hard to believe, isn't it, that someone you love could betray you in such a devastating way. But this is not a story of redemption. This is a story of destruction, of a man pushed to the edge by the unbearable weight of his own life. And what happens next? You won't be prepared for it. The tension keeps building, and the cracks in the family grow wider, but no one can see it. At least not yet. But here's the thing. Every moment you spend thinking you know how this ends, you're wrong. Because the real story, the real secret, it's just getting started. And it's going to tear them apart. You'll hear Darnell's side of the story. You'll understand the weight he carries. The pressure to maintain his family's image, the shame of failure, the betrayal of his wife. But what about Tasha? What about her truth? What about the burden she carries? And Gordy, the one who holds all the power, the one who stands at the center of it all? What part does he play in this devastating unraveling? On August 3rd, 2022, Darnell Davis, a 39-year-old father of three, walked into the Hillside Medical Center in Gainesville, Florida, for what he believed to be a routine checkup. The kind of appointment he'd put off for too long, but one he finally decided to attend after weeks of feeling run down, constantly fatigued, unable to keep up with the energy he once had. His work, his family, everything seemed to weigh on him more than it ever had before. Nothing unusual about the checkup. The clinic had been a familiar place, a healthcare provider he trusted. The nurse took his blood pressure, checked his heart rate, ran a few routine tests, and took some blood samples. But as he sat there waiting for the doctor to arrive, Darnell had no idea that this appointment, one he almost canceled, was about to shatter the very foundation of his life. At 3:30 p.m., Dr. Adam Fields, the family physician Darnell had known for years, entered the examination room. His greeting was standard, a casual, "How's everything going, Darnell?" But as he flipped through the chart, something was off. There was an unease in his demeanor, and Darnell immediately noticed it. "I've been looking at the results from your tests," Dr. Fields said, his voice softer than usual. "We've found something that we need to discuss. I'll be blunt with you. There's a problem with your fertility." Darnell felt a chill sweep through him. He thought he'd misheard. "Fertility?" Darnell echoed, a pit forming in his stomach. "What do you mean?" "I've got 3 kids, man." "What do you mean?" Dr. Fields took a breath before continuing. "I'm afraid the tests indicate that you're sterile, Darnell. There's no sperm production." The word struck Darnell like a blow to the chest. He froze, unable to process what he was hearing. Sterile? The man who had been the proud father of 3 children, the one who had held his family together through thick and thin, was now being told that he could never have children of his own. The doctor explained further, offering possible treatments and a second opinion, but Darnell heard nothing after that. The world around him faded to a blur as his mind tried to grasp the implications of what he'd just learned. The fatherhood he'd so proudly claimed, the life he'd worked so hard to build. All of it was now tainted. He stumbled out of the examination room, the weight of the diagnosis pressing down on him like an anchor dragging him into the depths. The following evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Darnell sat in the living room of his home in Gainesville, Florida, staring into the quiet of his family's once peaceful life. Tasha, his wife of 15 years, sat across from him, her eyes glued to her phone. The kids were upstairs, oblivious to the storm that was gathering downstairs. Darnell had kept his diagnosis to himself for 24 hours, the shock still lingering. But as the silence between him and Tasha grew heavier, he felt a pull, an undeniable need to know the truth. He couldn't let it fester any longer. His mind, already clouded with confusion and anger, needed resolution. "Tasha," he began, his voice trembling as he looked at her. "I need to know something. Are the kids mine?" Tasha's head snapped up, and for a brief moment, Darnell saw a flash of panic in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and Darnell could feel the air in the room shift. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke in a voice so small it barely reached his ears. "No, Darnell. Gordy is their father." The truth hit him like a freight train. The man he had come to despise, Tasha's stepfather, had been the biological father of all 3 of their children. Darnell's chest tightened, his heart racing as he tried to process the betrayal. The children he had raised, loved, and protected. They were not his. The family he had thought he was a part of had been nothing more than a lie. Gordy? Darnell repeated, disbelief dripping from his voice. How long, Tasha? How long has this been going on? She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. The regret in her eyes was apparent, but the damage was done. It was years ago, before we even met. It was a mistake, Darnell. But the kids, they're his. Not yours. The words cut through him, each syllable like a jagged knife. The woman he had trusted, the family he had worked so hard to build, all of it had been built on a foundation of lies. His entire sense of self-worth, his identity as a father, crumbled in that moment. The next few days were a blur of rage, disbelief, and sorrow. Darnell couldn't stop the questions from swirling in his mind. How could she? Why didn't I know? What was I to them all these years? Each question felt like a stab to his chest, and the more he thought about it, the more he felt like a fool. All the years he had spent building a life with Tasha, the years he had spent raising her children as his own, were now meaningless. The world he had fought for, his pride, his sense of accomplishment, gone in an instant. And as Darnell's mind raced, so too did his emotions. Anger, shame, humiliation, and a sense of betrayal that consumed him whole. He began to feel powerless, unable to regain control of the life he had so carefully crafted. By the evening of August 5th, 2022, Darnell found himself alone in the garage, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He felt the pull of revenge, the need to make things right, to get even. His thoughts, clouded by the fury of betrayal, began to take a darker turn. He hadn't yet decided what to do, but as the hours ticked by, the thought of confronting Tasha, of confronting Gordy, began to feel like a necessity, a need to regain control over the life that had been stolen from him. August 5th, 2022, the Florida sun had set, but the oppressive humidity of the day lingered in the air. Darnell sat in the quiet of his living room, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. His hands trembled as he gripped a glass of cheap whiskey, the amber liquid swirling lazily in the tumbler. But the storm inside his mind was anything but slow. Every call from his creditors had felt like a hammer striking a nail. He could hear their demands echoing in his skull, each word driving him deeper into the hole that was his life. Darnell had tried to make it work, tried to build a life with Tasha, a family, but now he saw it all for what it was, an illusion. His children weren't his. Tasha wasn't truly his either. She had been lying to him all along. And Gordy, Tasha's stepfather, he was the man who held the key to it all, the man who stood between Darnell and the life he believed he deserved. He had to go. Darnell never considered confronting Gordy directly. It wasn't that he didn't want to. The thought had crossed his mind more than once. But there was something deeper, something more dangerous about the idea of face-to-face confrontation. The anger that burned inside him was sharp and uncontrollable, like a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. He knew that if he approached Gordy, if he let the words fly, if he gave into the impulse to scream his pain and betrayal, there was no telling how far that anger would go. The fear of losing control, of doing something in the heat of the moment that would unravel his entire life, made him hesitate. He wasn't just angry at Gordy. He was angry at himself. Angry for letting things go this far, for putting himself in this position. Gordy was a tough man with a cold, calculated demeanor. Darnell had always been intimidated by that. By the way Gordy carried himself with such confidence, with such power. Confronting him wasn't just about confronting a stepfather. It was about confronting a man who had always seen him as lesser. Darnell wasn't sure he could win that battle. Gordy had the power, the wealth, and the connections. Darnell had nothing left but his pride, and that, he feared, wouldn't be enough. In a way, confronting Gordy would have been too personal, too messy, and Darnell didn't want to give Gordy the satisfaction of knowing how badly he had broken him. So, Darnell chose the cold route instead. He took the decision to eliminate him quietly, with no fanfare, no confrontation, just an act that would sever the strings Gordy had tied him down with once and for all. By killing him in such a detached way, he could ensure that Gordy's death would be a clean break. Darnell's mind turned colder, harder. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. The idea of killing Gordy was not born from impulsive rage, but from cold, calculated desperation. Darnell had lost everything he thought he owned, his family, his pride, and his sense of control. Gordy was the root cause of all his misery, but there was more to it than just personal betrayal. His wife, Gordy's stepdaughter, would inherit everything upon Gordy's death. Darnell could almost taste the wealth that would come to her, but that inheritance would never come to him unless Gordy was removed from the picture entirely. If Gordy died, his wife would inherit the fortune, and Darnell would be the one to take control of it. The money, the power, the life he thought he deserved. It was the only way Darnell could truly reclaim what he had lost. The idea of being stuck in this fragile existence, his dignity stripped away, was unbearable. But if Gordy were gone, it would be different. No one would question his authority. No one would know the truth about the children, about the betrayal. It would be a fresh start, a new beginning with all of Gordy's wealth at his disposal. But then Darnell thought further. If he killed Gordy, it wouldn't be enough. His wife, Tasha, was still a risk. She had always been a complicated part of the equation. The secrets she kept, her knowledge of the truth, and the delicate balance of their marriage made her dangerous. If she knew about his plans, she would be a threat. She could expose him. In Darnell's mind, she couldn't be trusted. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. So, the plan grew clearer in his mind. First, Gordy had to go, and then Tasha. One was a necessary step to regain control, and the other was a final safeguard to keep his secret intact. A ruthless path, but one Darnell was now willing to walk. If he could make both disappear, he would have everything: power, money, and a life where he could finally stand tall. The only problem now was ensuring that Gordy and Tasha would never see it coming. How to ensure their deaths were clean, undetected, and would leave no trace of his involvement. Everything was in place for Darnell to reclaim his life, but the choices he made now would push him further down a dark path, one from which there was no return. Darnell's plan to eliminate Gordy was a chilling, methodical execution that left no room for error. The idea of a violent confrontation was out of the question. No, this had to be more subtle, more precise. He knew the only way to ensure Gordy's death would be untraceable was to make it seem like something entirely natural, something no one would ever question. It took Darnell weeks of careful planning, observing Gordy's routines, his habits, his health. The older man was tough, resilient, but Darnell knew he wasn't invincible. It wasn't about overpowering him. It was about taking advantage of the smallest vulnerability. Gordy was a heavy drinker, often mixing alcohol with prescription medication. Darnell had already learned which medications Gordy took for his back pain, a daily prescription for a strong painkiller called oxycodone, a powerful opioid. The drug was easily accessible. Darnell had no need to make any drastic moves. He swapped out the bottles when he had the chance, carefully replacing Gordy's prescription with a lethal dose of oxycodone, laced with fentanyl, a synthetic opioid far more potent than what Gordy was used to. Fentanyl was notorious for its deadly potency, even in small amounts. Gordy would never have known. The bottles looked identical. Nothing would raise an eyebrow. Darnell knew that when Gordy would take his usual dose, the combination of oxycodone and the fentanyl would quickly overpower him, leading to an overdose that looked entirely natural. On the night it happened, Darnell watched from a distance as Gordy followed his usual routine, pouring the drink, popping the pills, and settling down for the night. It was so effortless. As Gordy's breathing slowed, Darnell felt a strange calmness wash over him. It was over. The man who had been the center of his torment was now lying unconscious in his own home, the drugs doing their work. The death would seem like an unfortunate consequence of Gordy's bad habits. No one would ever suspect foul play. Hours later, Gordy was found, lifeless in his recliner, the empty glass of whiskey resting beside him. His death was ruled as natural causes, a mix of alcohol and the overdose of medication. Darnell's heart pounded in his chest as he stood by, pretending to grieve like everyone else. But deep down, he was unshaken. It was cold, it was calculated, and no one would ever know he was responsible. He stood over Gordy's lifeless body, his expression unchanged, as though he had simply taken out the trash. There was no satisfaction in this moment, only a sense of relief. He had regained control. He had done what needed to be done, and it was all so perfect, so seamless, that no one would ever question the circumstances of Gordy's death. And in that moment, Darnell knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. But for him, it wasn't about guilt or remorse. It was about survival, and this was the price he was willing to pay. With Gordy gone, Darnell thought he had removed the biggest threat to his carefully constructed world. But there was still one person left, Tasha. She was still too close, still too dangerous. She had been living with the knowledge of the truth about their children, and now, her increasing paranoia and the questions she was starting to ask about his behavior were only making things worse. Tasha could feel the tension in the air. Darnell, the man she had married, was distant. He barely spoke to her, never mentioned the children, never even mentioned Gordy. He just stared at her sometimes, his gaze cold and calculating, as though he was seeing something else entirely. The distance between them had grown to the point where she began to wonder if he had finally snapped, or if there was something he was hiding. But what unsettled her most was the fact that Darnell hadn't confronted her, hadn't confronted anyone. He had learned the truth about their children's paternity, and still, there had been no outburst, no anger, no action at all. She had expected some kind of explosion, a confrontation, an argument. Instead, he had retreated into himself, silent and implacable. It was this silence, more than anything, that gnawed at her. She began to fear that Darnell wasn't just avoiding the issue. He was waiting for something, for the right moment perhaps, or for everything to fall into place. And that terrified her, but she couldn't bring herself to ask him directly. She had seen the darkness in his eyes, the emptiness, and she wasn't sure she could bear it if she pushed him too far. So she tried to hold on, to keep everything together, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She started to think about how far she could go without crossing a line, but deep down, she knew she couldn't outrun the danger that seemed to be closing in on her. In his mind, Darnell had already decided what needed to be done. Tasha, in her growing anxiety, had become too much of a threat. She had started asking questions that he didn't want answered. She was seeing too much, sensing too much. There was only one way to keep his life intact and remove the final obstacle standing in his path. It wasn't about rage or emotion. It was about control. It was about making sure Tasha, like Gordy, would be erased from the equation without a trace. One cold night, Darnell's mind was made up. He had to make it look like an accident, something that would leave no room for suspicion, something so clean, so simple, that no one would question it. He knew exactly how to do it. It was going to be her car, the brakes, the key to everything, a tiny, precise intervention that would ensure she wouldn't survive. He waited until she was out with the children, giving him the time he needed to prepare. When she returned, the stage was set. He had tampered with the brake lines of her car just enough so that when the moment came, they would fail. Darnell couldn't help but feel a cold sense of finality as he stood in the driveway, waiting. His heart raced, not with fear or excitement, but with something else, something that made him feel more alive than he had in weeks. He was finally doing what needed to be done. The moment arrived as she pulled into the driveway. As soon as Tasha pressed down on the brake, it would be too late. The brakes wouldn't respond. The car would careen off the road, and there would be no one left to tell the tale. It would look like an accident, just another tragic, random event. No one would think twice. It would all be over. And then, with the final piece of the puzzle gone, Darnell could breathe again. He could return to his life without the burden of secrets, without the fear of exposure. With Tasha's death, there would be no more obstacles. The truth would die with her. Darnell knew the timing had to be perfect. Tasha had taken the kids out for a brief visit, leaving him alone with the house and his thoughts. As soon as she was out of sight, he made his move. He quietly slipped out of the house, making sure to keep everything under wraps. His steps were deliberate as he walked toward the garage, then to her car, parked in its usual spot. With the kids out, Darnell had the perfect opportunity to tamper with the brakes. He wasn't in a rush. He was careful, methodical. He knew exactly where to make the small adjustments that would ensure her car wouldn't stop when she needed it most. It had to look like an accident. No one could suspect foul play. After he finished, Darnell stepped back, eyeing the car with cold detachment. He wiped his hands on his pants, making sure there was no trace left. Then, with the same calculated ease, he returned to the house, as if nothing had happened. He didn't even glance at the clock. He knew Tasha wouldn't be home for another hour. Plenty of time for him to slip into the routine of their lives, pretending nothing was wrong. When Tasha finally returned, Darnell was already back on the couch, trying to appear casual. She walked in, slightly distracted, checking in with the kids. As she went to her car to retrieve a few bags, Darnell's eyes followed her, watching with that cold, empty gaze. She didn't notice anything. She had no reason to. The moment she sat behind the wheel and drove off, Darnell felt a strange sense of peace. He didn't feel the anxiety he once might have. It was as if, in that moment, everything was falling into place. It was only a few minutes later when he heard the screeching of tires. The sound echoed across the quiet neighborhood, an unnatural noise that was quickly followed by the unmistakable crash. Darnell didn't jump up. He didn't rush to the scene. Instead, he sat still, his heart thumping in his chest, but his face still. Calm. He waited. He knew the car had gone off the road. He knew Tasha wouldn't survive the impact. He had made sure of it. The crash would be ruled an accident. No one would suspect anything. Just another tragic, random event. And just like that, the final obstacle was removed. The inheritance, the secrets, the haunting reality. Everything was now in his hands. As Darnell stayed frozen in his seat, the only thing that filled his mind was the thought that there was nothing left to fear. Tasha's tragic and violent death shook the community to its core, setting the stage for a police investigation that would soon reveal more than anyone could have expected. The moment the call came in, Detective Mary Lawson arrived at the scene. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine car accident. A woman, alone in a new car, had driven off the road and into a tree. The cause, failed brakes, seemed like an unfortunate mechanical malfunction. Yet something about the incident didn't feel right. Tasha's death was too neat, too convenient. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the situation was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Darnell, Tasha's husband, seemed unerringly composed in the wake of the tragedy. His cool demeanor, coupled with his unwavering commitment to his family, led investigators to believe that he was simply a grieving husband trying to hold it all together. For a while, he appeared to be in the clear, his grief cloaked in a calm exterior. But Detective Lawson knew better. Subtle inconsistencies in Darnell's story began to raise alarms. His timeline didn't add up in certain details, insignificant to the untrained eye, struck her as deeply troubling. As Detective Lawson dug deeper, she began uncovering troubling signs that pointed to Darnell. There were whispers about his mounting financial stress, bills piling up, unpaid debts, and signs that his once successful life was teetering on the edge. His marriage to Tasha, once solid, had become increasingly strained. The inheritance from Gordy's estate had clearly changed the dynamics between them. Tasha had gone from a worried, vulnerable woman to someone who seemed to have taken charge of her destiny, someone with power. And Darnell? He seemed to be losing his grip. But it wasn't just his finances and marriage that raised suspicion. Darnell's behavior, particularly in the days surrounding both Gordy and Tasha's deaths, seemed off. There were reports of strange interactions with the people closest to him, moments when his cool exterior slipped, revealing cracks in his carefully constructed facade. He was more nervous than usual, more erratic. Lawson's gut told her that there was more to this than just a string of coincidences. But despite her growing suspicions, the lack of concrete evidence left her powerless to make an arrest. There was no smoking gun yet. As the investigation deepened, the police turned their attention to the couple's children, Brandon and Layla. Both had been close to their mother, and both had been unsettled by the changes in their father's behavior. They were brought in for questioning, with Detective Lawson hoping to find cracks in their stories that might offer a breakthrough. The siblings, though reluctant, found themselves caught between their loyalty to their father and the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Brandon, the older of the two, had begun to notice shifts in Darnell's behavior long before Tasha's death. He had overheard his father, on more than one occasion, discussing money, inheritance, and things that didn't seem to fit. Layla, the more intuitive of the two, had begun asking pointed questions about the deaths. Questions her father seemed to avoid. The tension between them and Darnell was palpable, and while they couldn't put their suspicions into words, they knew something wasn't right. They loved their father, but they were starting to see him in a different light. Detective Lawson tried to leverage the growing mistrust between the siblings and their father. She knew that if she could get them to open up, even just a little, she might be able to piece together a clearer picture. But Brandon and Layla were torn, conflicted between the love they had for their father and the mounting evidence that their family was unraveling in ways they couldn't understand. As the investigation picked up momentum, the pressure on Darnell increased. He began to feel the heat, and his composure started to crack. The cool, collected exterior that had once served him so well began to falter under the weight of suspicion. His interactions with the police became increasingly strained, his patience wearing thin. There were moments when he lashed out, and others when he grew overly defensive, almost as if he was trying too hard to appear innocent. Darnell's once charming demeanor began to shift. He no longer seemed like the calm, grieving husband. He was a man on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder, convinced that the authorities were closing in on him. The cracks were widening, and Detective Lawson could feel it. His behavior, once meticulously controlled, now seemed like a performance, a mask that was starting to slip. And with every mistake he made, every lie he told, the walls began to close in on him. Then came the breakthrough. It was a seemingly small detail, something that most would have overlooked, but to Detective Lawson, it was the key. Forensic evidence, coupled with witness testimonies, began to paint a clear picture. Tasha's death had not been the result of a mechanical failure. It had been tampered with. The brake lines, pristine just days before, showed signs of being deliberately altered. The timing of the incident, combined with the mounting evidence, all pointed back to Darnell. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that turned the tide. Lawson had also uncovered a disturbing pattern, the same strange behavior that had surrounded Gordy's death. Darnell had been there, involved, lurking in the shadows, orchestrating a series of events that had left him with nothing but control. Gordy's death was no longer just an unfortunate tragedy. It was the first step in a twisted plan, a plan that had been carried out with chilling precision. Detective Lawson now had enough to move forward. The case against Darnell was building, and the manhunt began. Darnell had thought he could get away with it all. He had thought he could erase his problems, one by one, until nothing stood in his way. But the truth had a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how carefully it was hidden. The tension in the room was palpable as Darnell sat there, his hands clenched, his body stiff. Detective Lawson had waited for this moment, the moment when Darnell could no longer hide behind his lies. After a long silence, Darnell's voice broke through, shaky but filled with an overwhelming sense of defeat. "I didn't ask for this, any of this." Lawson watched him closely, her pen still, waiting for him to continue. "I spent years, years being lied to. Tasha and Gordy, they kept this secret from me. The kids, they weren't even mine. His voice faltered, the words coming out with a mix of pain and fury. I spent so much time loving those kids, raising them like they were mine, and all along they weren't. Lawson's mind raced as the truth began to unfurl. What do you mean they weren't yours, Darnell? Darnell looked down at his hands, his breath shaky as he continued. I found out years ago, Lawson, but I didn't know what to do with it. Tasha had lied to me, told me that Gordy was the father, and I believed her. I raised them, took care of them, spent my life thinking they were mine. But when I found out the truth, when I finally learned that they were Gordy's, his voice trailed off, and for a moment, the room felt suffocating. I had to act. Lawson leaned forward, sensing that Darnell was nearing the heart of his confession. What do you mean, you had to act, Darnell? Darnell's gaze shifted to the floor, his jaw tightening. The debts, the bills. I was drowning in them. Tasha had no idea how far gone I was. She thought I was handling things, but I wasn't. I couldn't keep up with the lies. And the inheritance, Gordy's money, it was mine and I needed it. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the betrayal. All those years, I raised those kids as mine. And now I had to live with the fact that I'd been lied to, deceived by Tasha, by Gordy. And Gordy, he knew the truth, and he was getting closer to exposing it. He was going to tell everyone. He was going to take everything from me. Tasha, the money, the kids. Everything I thought was mine. Darnell's voice grew cold, his eyes narrowing. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let him ruin everything. So, I did what I had to do. I got rid of them, Tasha and Gordy. It wasn't just for the money, Lawson. It was for control. I needed to erase everything they had taken from me. I needed to be free of their lies, of this life that wasn't even mine. His breath was heavy now, his confession laying bare the twisted web of lies and deceit he had woven for years. I tampered with Tasha's car, made sure the brakes would fail. When she died, Lawson sat still, absorbing the weight of his confession. Darnell had been living with the pain of betrayal for years, an overwhelming sense of injustice that had driven him to do the unthinkable. He had killed Tasha and Gordy to secure what he believed was his, the inheritance, the control, and his version of the truth. And you thought getting rid of them would fix everything? Lawson asked softly, her tone matter-of-fact, but her eyes never leaving his. Darnell looked up at her, his eyes hollow. It should have, but now I see. Now I understand. It wasn't worth it. It never was. For a moment, there was only silence in the room. The confession had come out in a rush, a desperate admission of guilt that left Darnell hollowed out, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. But Lawson knew that this was just the beginning. The truth was out, but the consequences of Darnell's actions would continue to unfold. He had killed not just for money, but to erase the pain of years of deceit. And in the end, it had cost him everything. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Darnell stood before the judge, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. His once calm demeanor had dissolved entirely, replaced by the hollow eyes of a man who knew his fate was sealed. His confession, combined with the mounting evidence, had left little room for any defense. He had no choice but to face the consequences of his chilling betrayal. Detective Mary Lawson sat in the gallery, her eyes fixed on Darnell as he was led to the stand. Her role in the case had been pivotal. Her sharp instincts had uncovered the truth when everything else had pointed to an unfortunate accident. She had seen the unraveling of a man desperate to cover his sins. But now, as the final judgment loomed, she felt a bittersweet relief. Justice would be served, but it wouldn't bring back Tasha and Gordy. It wouldn't undo the pain Darnell had inflicted on his own family. The judge's gavel rang out, signaling the beginning of Darnell's sentencing. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor stood to read the charges against him. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of fraud. The atmosphere in the room was thick with emotion, with Tasha and Gordy's family members, as well as community members who had once trusted Darnell, watching with varying degrees of grief and disbelief. The judge, a stern figure with years of experience, addressed Darnell with a voice full of authority. "Darnell Miller," the judge began, "you have been convicted of 2 brutal murders, the cold-blooded deaths of your wife, Tasha Miller, and your stepfather, Gordy. You deceived your family, your community, and the very people who trusted you. In your quest for control, you erased the lives of those who loved you. Your actions were calculated, cruel, and without remorse." Darnell stood motionless, his eyes not meeting the judge's gaze. He knew the sentence would be severe, but no amount of time could undo the destruction he had wrought. "Given the gravity of your crimes," the judge continued, "and the profound impact you have had on your family, your sentence will reflect the severity of your actions. I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. May you reflect on the consequences of your choices for the rest of your days." The gavel came down again, final and unyielding. As Darnell was escorted out of the courtroom, his face devoid of emotion, there was no celebration from those who had witnessed his conviction. For the Miller family, justice had been served, but it was hollow. The truth had come out, but it couldn't bring back Tasha or Gordy. It couldn't undo the years of manipulation, the web of lies that Darnell had spun so carefully. Brandon and Layla, now fully aware of the truth about their paternity and their father's crimes, stood at the back of the courtroom, grappling with a mixture of emotions. They were numb, relieved that the nightmare was over, yet devastated by the realization that the man they had called their father was nothing more than a stranger. Their lives had been irrevocably changed, and they could not unsee the man who had orchestrated so much pain. The courtroom emptied, but the questions lingered. Detective Lawson was left with a deep sense of reflection as she walked out into the cold air, the weight of the case still pressing on her. There was no true closure, not for the Miller family and not for her. The investigation had answered some questions, but many remained unanswered. What was Darnell's true motivation beyond the inheritance? Why did he feel the need to destroy the very people who could have helped him? Could he have been stopped before it was too late? And most hauntingly, did he ever feel remorse for the lives he destroyed? For Lawson, the answers to these questions would remain elusive. But one thing was certain: justice had been served, even if it couldn't heal the wounds left behind. As for Brandon and Layla, they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The road ahead would be long, filled with pain and questions, but they now had the clarity they needed. The truth was out, and while it offered little comfort, it was the only thing they had left. Their father would spend the rest of his life behind bars, but they, too, would carry the weight of his actions forever. And with that, the case that had shaken their family to its core came to a close. But the scars would last a lifetime. If you enjoyed this story and want to stay updated with more thrilling twists and powerful narratives, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Don't miss out on future content. Subscribe now and join the journey with us.